pull the blanket up a little higher, settle your head against the pillow, and let the world outside grow quiet. Perhaps there is frost on the windowpane, or the sound of wind slipping through the eaves. Tonight we are going to travel backward in time, to a winter very different from the one you are safe from now. In our modern world, when the snow falls and the thermometer drops, we simply turn up the heat, open the refrigerator, and if we must leave the house, we trust the roads have been salted and plowed. But for most of human history, winter was not just a season. It was a siege, a quiet, creeping blockade of cold and darkness that cut off towns, villages, and even entire empires from one another. When the roads closed, as they did every year under the weight of ice and snow, the real question was not whether the mail would be delayed. The real question was whether anyone would survive until spring. Imagine, if you will, a Roman legionary stationed on the frontier of Britannia, somewhere along Hadrian's wall in the deep of a northern winter. The wind howls across the moors, carrying sleet that stings the face, and the ground is frozen so hard that digging a proper latrine trench takes half the day. The roads that connect this fort to the rest of the empire have become ribbons of treacherous ice, then thick mud when the sun dares to show itself for a few weak hours. Supply wagons that normally roll in from the south, laden with grain and wine and salted pork, have stopped arriving. The commander has issued a rationing order. Each soldier gets a bit less bread, a smaller portion of pasca, that sour wine vinegar drink they use to cut the water. And the men grumble, but they also understand. This is the rhythm of the year. Every empire, from the Romans to the Han Chinese to the Incas, had to face the same quiet terror, the knowledge that for several months you were on your own. Now, we might think of empires as vast, sprawling networks of power, connected by roads and messengers, and the constant movement of goods. And that is true for most of the year. But winter was a different world. It was a time when the empire essentially folded in upon itself, like a great beast curling into a den to sleep. The roads became impassable, not just for carts, but for riders on horseback, for foot couriers, for anyone foolish enough to try. Mountain passes filled with snowdrifts deep enough to swallow a mule. Rivers froze solid, which sounds like it might help travel, and it did in some places, like the frozen canals of the Netherlands, where people skated to market. But for most of the ancient world, an icy river meant no boats, no ferries, and no way to cross except by risk taking your life on cracking ice. So the cities, the forts, the frontier outposts, the great estates, they all had to become self-sufficient in the way that a small island is self-sufficient. They had to store enough food, enough fuel, and enough patience to last until the thaw. Let us consider the Roman Empire, which is the most famous example, but not the only one. The Romans were masters of logistics, but even they could not command the weather. Their solution was a massive network of state-run storage facilities, what we might call granaries, but more than that, they were warehouses for life itself. Every major city had at least one horium, a great stone building with raised floors to keep out moisture and thick walls to keep out the cold. In these buildings, grain was piled high, enough to feed the population for months. The grain dole in Rome, the annona, was a political tool, but it was also a survival mechanism. When the ships from Egypt could not sail because of winter storms, the people of Rome still had bread because the grain had been stored from the harvest. And the same was true for the legions. Each fort had its own granaries, and the amount of grain stored was carefully calculated based on the number of soldiers and the length of the expected siege of winter. But grain is only part of the story. People need other things to get through a harsh winter. They need fuel for heat, which meant wood or charcoal. They need fodder for their animals. They need salt for preserving meat, and oil for lamps, and wool for clothing. And the ancient empires had to plan for all of this, not just for the capital city, but for every remote corner of their territory. The Han Dynasty of China, for instance, maintained a system of state granaries that were even more elaborate than the Roman ones. They had a sophisticated system of tax collection in kind, where grain was gathered from the provinces and stored in regional centers, then redistributed in times of scarcity. The Han also built great earthen pits, lined with clay and covered with waterproof roofs, to store grain for years at a time. Some of these pits were enormous, capable of holding tens of thousands of bushels of millet and rice. And yet, even with all this preparation, the winter could still bring surprises. A deep snow that lasted too long, a sudden cold snap that killed the winter wheat in the fields, a fire in the granary. These were disasters that could doom a community. So the empires also relied on a network of local responses, things that were not always recorded in the official histories, but were passed down through families and villages. One of these was the practice of moving people to places where supplies were more abundant. In the Roman Empire, wealthy landowners had villas in the countryside where they could retreat with their households, living off their own stores of food and fuel, while the poorer people in the cities sometimes had to rely on public distribution or the charity of the rich. In China, there was a tradition of the emperor personally overseeing the relief efforts during a winter famine, sending grain from the capital, and even reducing his own consumption as a gesture of solidarity. Another strategy was to keep the roads open as long as possible, but not by fighting the weather directly. Instead, they built inns and posting stations at regular intervals along major routes, so that travelers and messengers could find shelter and a change of horses. The Romans called these mansions, and they were staffed year-round, even in the dead of winter. The messengers who carried imperial dispatches, the frumentarii, were trained to travel in all conditions, using relay stations to move at incredible speed. But even they had to stop when the roads became truly impassable. So the system had its limits. Perhaps the most ingenious solution was found in the Andes, among the Inca Empire. They did not have wheeled vehicles or horses, but they had a network of roads that stretched from Colombia to Chile, crossing high mountain passes that were snowed in for much of the year. The Incas built bridges of woven grass, suspension bridges that could be quickly dismantled and stored when winter came to prevent them from being destroyed by ice and floods. They also had a system of tambos, storehouses that were stocked with dried meat, potatoes, and quinoa, along with fuel and supplies. These tambos were placed at intervals of about a day's travel, so that even in the harshest weather, a traveler or a messenger could find warmth and food. And the Incas had a secret weapon, freeze-dried potatoes, known as chuño. They would let potatoes freeze at high altitude, then trample them to remove the moisture, creating a food that could last for years. In winter, when fresh food was scarce, chuño was a lifeline. So you see, dear listener, the ancient empires did not simply huddle and hope for the best. They built a culture of preparation that was woven into the very fabric of their societies. They stored, they planned, they built infrastructure that could endure the quiet violence of cold. And yet, for all their cleverness, the winter remained a time of uncertainty. No amount of stored grain could guarantee that the spring would come soon enough. No system of tambos could prevent a blizzard from burying a trail. The people of those times lived with a kind of patient fear, a knowledge that each winter was a test, and they passed it not by conquering the cold, but by working together, by sharing what they had, and by keeping a fire of hope burning in the darkest months. Let us lean into that quiet wisdom now. Think of your own pantry, your own cupboards, the jars of preserves and bags of rice that sit waiting. They are not just food. They are a small echo of that ancient instinct, the instinct to prepare for a time of scarcity. And when you listen to the wind tonight, perhaps you can hear, just faintly, the voices of those who came before, the farmers and soldiers and merchants who knew that winter was a closed road, but also a path inward, a time to tend to the hearth and the family and the stories that kept them alive. We will continue this journey, slow and steady, into the heart of those cold seasons. For now, let the warmth of your own home hold you, and let the old ways of the empires breathe softly in your imagination, like a distant campfire flickering against the snow. Now, let us drift a little further east to the lands of the Persian Empire, where the winter was no less harsh, but the solutions were shaped by a landscape of deserts and mountains. The Persians were masters of water, building underground canals called qanats that brought meltwater from the hills to the cities, even when the surface streams were frozen. But water alone does not fill a belly. They also stored grain in deep silos cut into the rock, sometimes hidden beneath the floors of their homes, so that even if an enemy or a winter storm cut off the supply lines, a family could survive for months on what lay beneath their feet. And they had a tradition of the winter market, a covered bazaar where merchants sold dried fruits, nuts, and salted meats, all preserved with the careful use of honey and vinegar. The bazaar itself was a warm place, with braziers glowing at the corners, and the air thick with the smell of spices and wool. People would gather there not just to trade, but to share news, to tell stories, to remind each other that the cold would not last forever. Do not think that all this preparation was simply a matter of government orders and stone warehouses. Much of it was personal, intimate, passed from mother to daughter, father to son. In the villages of the Roman provinces, for example, every household had its own root cellar, a dugout beneath the house or barn where turnips, cabbages, and apples were layered with straw to keep them from freezing. The root cellar was a sacred space, dark and cool and smelling of earth. Children would be sent down with a candle to fetch a few potatoes for the stew, and they would linger, feeling the weight of the earth above them, the silence of the sleeping vegetables. And there was the art of turning milk into cheese that would keep through the winter, or meat into sausage, or fruit into leather. These were not just recipes, they were acts of hope, a way of saying to the coming months, "We will not be defeated by your cold." And then there was the matter of keeping warm. The Romans had central heating of a sort. The wealthy built hypocausts, a system of raised floors and hollow walls where hot air from a furnace could circulate. But for most people, warmth came from the hearth fire, a single flame that had to be fed constantly. Fuel was a constant worry. In the forests of Gaul and Germany, the winter meant cutting wood and stacking it to dry. But the wood had to be gathered before the snows came, or it would be buried and useless. In treeless regions, like parts of North Africa or the Middle East, people used dried animal dung as fuel, or they burned the thorny scrub that grew in the wadis. The smoke from these fires filled the homes, and the soot blackened the walls, but it was a sign of life. When you saw a curl of smoke rising from a distant roof in the winter twilight, you knew that someone was still there, still fighting the cold. The ancient empires also had to think about their animals. Horses, oxen, mules, camels, these were the engines of their economy, and they could not be allowed to starve or freeze. The Romans built stables with thick stone walls and low ceilings to conserve heat. They stored hay and oats in lofts above the animals, so that the warmth of the beasts would rise and keep the fodder from freezing. The Han Chinese kept their draft animals in brick-lined shelters, and they fed them on a mixture of chopped straw and beans, a high-energy diet to keep them strong through the winter. In the far north, among the Scythians and other nomadic peoples, the horses were left to graze on the steppe, even in winter, pawing through the snow to find the grass beneath. The Scythians had a saying, "A horse that cannot find its own food in winter is not worth keeping." But that was a hard life, and not all empires could rely on such toughness. Now, let us think about the roads themselves. The Romans and the Persians and the Chinese all built great roads, but they did not expect them to be passable all year round. Instead, they built them with a kind of patience, a knowledge that the road would be usable for only part of the year, and that was enough. The Roman roads were famously straight, but they were also built on a foundation of gravel and sand that drained water away, so that they would not turn to mud in the autumn rains. But when the snow fell, the roads became a different thing. They could be used for sledges if the snow was packed hard. The Romans had a word for a snow-covered road, via Himalis, a winter road. They would sometimes mark the edges with stakes, so that travelers would not wander off into the drifts. And they had a tradition of the winter courier, a man who would travel on skis or snowshoes in the northern provinces, carrying messages from one fort to another. It was a lonely job and a dangerous one, but it meant that the empire never completely lost contact with its farthest outposts. In China, the winter roads were maintained by a system of corvée labor, where local villagers were required to clear the snow from certain stretches. The emperor would issue a decree each autumn, reminding the provinces to prepare for the winter, to repair the bridges, to stock the granaries, to dig the wells deeper so they would not freeze. These decrees were read aloud in the marketplaces, and they had a rhythm to them, almost like a prayer. The people would listen, nodding, and then they would go home and check their own stores, their own firewood, their own supply of warm clothes. The emperor could not be everywhere, but his words traveled, and they carried a kind of comfort, a reminder that the state was thinking of them. But perhaps the most intimate winter survival strategy was the one that did not involve food or fuel at all. It was the strategy of the mind, the resilience that came from knowing that you were not alone. In the long winter nights, people told stories. They sang songs. They played games. They sewed and carved and mended. The old men would recall the winters of their youth, the one where the snow was so deep that you could step out of a second-story window onto a drift, the one where the wolves came right into the village, the one where a traveler was lost for 3 days and survived by drinking melted snow and eating his horse's saddle. These stories were not just entertainment. They were lessons. They were maps of survival, passed from one generation to the next. In the Norse sagas, there are tales of the great winter feasts, where the chieftains would gather their households in the long hall, and they would eat and drink and tell stories for days on end. The hall was built with a central hearth, and the smoke would rise through a hole in the roof, but enough heat remained to keep everyone warm if they huddled close. The mead would flow, and the skald would recite the deeds of heroes, and the children would listen with wide eyes, learning what it meant to be brave in the face of the cold. The feasts were a way of using up the stores that would not keep until spring, of turning the monotony of winter into a celebration of survival. The Incas had a similar tradition. They called it the Capac Rami, a festival at the winter solstice when the sun was farthest away and the cold was deepest. They would perform rituals to call the sun back, to ask for warmth and light. They would make offerings of coca leaves and llama fat, and they would dance in the plazas, their feet keeping time with the rhythm of the earth. The festival was a reminder that the darkest time was also a turning point, that the days would soon begin to lengthen, and that spring was always, always on the way. So you see, dear listener, the ancient empires did not just survive the winter. They honored it. They wove it into their calendars, their myths, their daily routines. The closed roads were not a defeat, they were a door through which you could only pass by becoming still, by listening, by trusting that the storehouse was full and the fire was burning. And that trust, that quiet confidence, is perhaps the greatest gift they left us. We live in a world where the roads are rarely closed, where we can get strawberries in December and heat with a flick of a switch. But somewhere in our bones, we still remember. We still feel the old pull to stock the pantry, to check the weather, to gather the family around the hearth. It is an echo, but it is a true one. Let us sit with that echo for a moment. Imagine you are in a Roman villa, the wind howling outside, the snow piling against the shutters. The hearth is glowing, and the slaves are bringing in dishes of warm porridge and dried figs. The master of the house is reading from a scroll, but his eyes are tired, and he looks up every now and then to listen to the wind. He knows that the roads to the south are blocked, that no news has come from Rome in a week. But the granary is full, the woodpile is high, and the children are playing a game of knucklebones on the floor. He takes a sip of watered wine, and he feels a deep, slow calm. This is winter. This is how it has always been, and this is how it will be again. Or imagine a Han Chinese village, the sky a pale gray, the fields white and silent. The women are inside, their hands busy with spinning or weaving, their voices low in conversation. The men are repairing tools, sharpening blades, mending the roof where a leak has appeared. The children are practicing their writing on a board with a brush, their breath making little clouds in the cold air. The stove is burning, and the smell of millet porridge fills the room. There is a map of the stars on the wall, showing the constellations of winter, and the oldest grandfather points to them with a gnarled finger, telling the children the stories of the heavenly court. The winter is long, but the room is warm, and the stories are endless. In the Andes, a family of Inca farmers is huddled in a stone hut, the fire of dried llama dung casting a red glow on their faces. They are eating a stew of chuño and quinoa, with a little chili pepper for warmth. The father is carving a small figurine from a piece of bone, a little llama to bring luck. The mother is telling a story about the river god, who sleeps under the ice and will wake when the sun returns. The children listen, and they do not feel afraid. They know that the storehouse is full of potatoes and that the paths will open again. And so, dear listener, as you drift toward sleep, consider the quiet heroism of those ancient winters. The empires are gone, but the wisdom remains. The closed roads, the stored grain, the stories by the fire, they are all part of the long human journey, the journey through the cold and the dark, toward the light of another dawn. And your own journey tonight is just as real. Let the wind outside be your lullaby. Let the warmth of your blanket be your fort. And let the knowledge that you too are prepared, whether with a full pantry or a full heart, be your comfort. Sleep now and dream of the white roads, the silent forests, the distant fires. Sleep and know that spring will come as it always has, as it always will. But let us not leave the winter road just yet, dear listener, for there is another empire far to the north, where the snow did not close the roads so much as transform them into highways of a different kind. I am speaking of the Mongol Empire, that vast expanse of steppe and forest that stretched from the Sea of Japan to the edge of Europe. The Mongols were a people of the horse, yes, but they were also a people of the winter. They knew the cold intimately, as a neighbor who visits every year and stays for months. In the Mongolian winter, the temperature could fall to 30 degrees below zero, and the wind would sweep across the plain with a sound like a living thing. And yet the Mongols did not huddle in their tents and wait for spring. They moved, they rode, they conquered. You see, for the Mongol horsemen, winter was not an obstacle but an opportunity. The frozen rivers became roads. The flat, snow-covered plains became a surface as hard as stone. And the horses, small and sturdy, could run for great distances without sinking into mud. The Mongols would launch their campaigns in the winter precisely because the roads were closed to their enemies. The Chinese, the Persians, the Russians, they all assumed that no army would march when the snow was deep. But the Mongols did march, and they arrived when the defenders were half asleep by their fires, believing themselves safe. The winter road was a secret weapon, and the Mongols had a system for keeping their messengers alive on those frozen roads. They built relay stations, called erderer, every few miles, where a rider could find a fresh horse, a bowl of hot milk tea, and a place to sleep for a few hours. The erderer were stocked with fuel and food, and they were staffed by families who were responsible for keeping the station running all winter. The riders would carry a tablet with a falcon symbol, and they would shout as they approached, so that the station master would have the horse ready. It was a beautiful, precise machine of survival, and it meant that the Mongol Empire could send a message from one end of its territory to the other in a matter of weeks, even in the deepest winter. Imagine, if you will, one of those relay stations. It is a small compound of felt tents, surrounded by a windbreak of packed snow. The door is low, and you must stoop to enter, but inside the tent is a warmth that hits you like a wave. The fire is burning dung and a little wood, and the smoke rises through a hole in the roof, but the heat stays low, pooling around the central hearth. The station master is a man with a weathered face, his eyes squinting from years of staring into the white glare. He is stirring a pot of tea, adding salt and butter and milk, and the smell is rich and comforting. Outside, the wind moans, but inside, the tent is a pocket of peace. The messenger arrives, his face red with cold, his eyelashes frozen together. He dismounts, and the station master takes his horse, leading it to a sheltered spot where it will be fed and rubbed down. The messenger sits by the fire, and he is given a bowl of tea and a piece of dried meat. He rests for an hour, perhaps two, and then he is gone again, riding north or south, carrying the news of the empire. The Mongols also knew that winter was a time for the animals to rest and recover. The horses, the sheep, the goats, they all needed shelter from the worst storms, and they needed to be fed on stored hay and grain. The Mongol herders would build large corrals of packed snow, called kasha, where the animals could huddle together for warmth. They would break the ice on the streams so that the animals could drink. They would watch the sky for signs of a blizzard, and they would move the herds to a low valley or a forested hillside before the storm hit. It was a constant vigilance, a rhythm of care that kept the herds alive through the long months. And there is another winter story from the Mongols, one that is less about survival and more about the quiet beauty of the season. The Mongol poets and singers composed long songs about the winter, songs that described the way the stars seemed larger and closer in the cold air, the way the northern lights danced like curtains of silk, the way the snow muffled all sound until the world felt like a held breath. They sang about the white-tailed deer that came down from the mountains to forage, about the wolves that moved in silent packs, about the lone rider crossing the frozen plain, his breath a plume of steam, his heart full of a strange and solemn joy. These songs were not just entertainment. They were a way of making peace with the winter, of finding meaning in the cold. But let us travel now to a different corner of the ancient world, to the shores of the Baltic Sea, where the Vikings ruled the waves and the winters were long and dark. The Vikings were famous for their longships, but those ships were useless when the fjords froze solid. So the Vikings did what they had always done. They adapted. They built their houses with thick walls of turf and timber, and they dug the floors below ground level so that the earth itself acted as insulation. They stored their food in underground cellars that stayed cool but did not freeze, and they kept their livestock in the lower part of the house, where the animals' body heat helped warm the human spaces above. And the Vikings had a special relationship with the winter sea ice. When the coastal waters froze, they would use the ice as a new kind of road, traveling by sled or on skis to visit neighbors, to trade, to raid. They had a word for this, isvist, meaning ice knowledge. It was the ability to read the ice, to know where it was thick enough to cross and where it was treacherous, where the cracks would open and where the pressure ridges made travel impossible. The ice knowledge was passed from father to son, mother to daughter, and it was as precious as any treasure. One of the most remarkable Viking winter traditions was the practice of the Sather, a kind of sorcery that was often performed during the darkest months. The Sather woman would sit on a high platform, wearing a cloak of sealskin and carrying a staff, and she would chant in a low, rhythmic voice, seeking to see into the future, to ask the spirits for guidance, to ensure that the spring would come and the sea would open. The community would gather around her, their faces lit by the fire, and they would listen in silence, their breath visible in the cold air. The Sather was not just superstition. It was a ritual of hope, a way of focusing the collective will on the survival of the community. And then there was the food. The Vikings preserved their food in many ways. They dried fish in the cold wind. They fermented fish in pits underground. They hung meat in the smokehouse. They stored apples and berries in the snow. They made a kind of butter that could last for months. They brewed ale and mead, and they drank it warm by the fire. They ate a dish called skyr, a thick yogurt that was rich in protein and could be stored for weeks. And when the winter was at its worst, they would gather for a feast called a blot, where they would sacrifice an animal and offer its blood to the gods. And then they would eat the meat and drink the ale, and they would tell the stories of the heroes. But the winter story that stays with me, dear listener, is not about the great halls or the feasts. It is about a single Viking family living in a small farmstead on a fjord in Norway. The husband has gone out to check the animals, and the wife is inside, spinning wool by the fire. The children are asleep on a bench, wrapped in furs. The wind is howling, and the snow is piling against the door. The wife looks up from her spinning, and she listens. She hears the wind, yes, but she also hears something else, a faint sound like a bell coming from the fjord. It is the sound of the ice shifting, of the tide moving under the frozen surface. It is a sound that she has heard every winter since she was a child, and it tells her that the world is still alive, that the sea is still breathing, that the spring will come. She smiles, and she returns to her spinning. The wool is soft and warm, and the fire is steady, and her family is safe. That is the winter. That is the long, slow dance of survival. And now, let us go south again, to the Mediterranean, to the Byzantine Empire, where the winters were milder, but still formidable. The Byzantines inherited the Roman road system, but they also knew that the roads could be cut off by snow in the mountains and by floods in the lowlands. They maintained a system of imperial couriers called the cursus publicus, but even that could be slowed by the weather. So the Byzantines developed a network of signal fires and beacons, placed on hilltops and towers, that could carry a message from the capital to the borders in a matter of hours. The beacons were lit only in emergencies, but during the winter, when the roads were closed, they became a lifeline. Imagine a Byzantine watchman on a mountain pass in Anatolia. His station is a small stone tower with a fire pit on the roof and a store of dry wood and pine resin below. The wind is bitter and the snow is deep, but he is inside, wrapped in a thick woolen cloak, sipping a bowl of barley soup. He looks out the narrow window, scanning the horizon. In the distance, he sees a flash of light, a beacon from the next station. He counts the flashes, 3 long, 1 short. It is a message. The emperor is safe. The army is on the move. The winter roads are being cleared. The watchman climbs to the roof, his boots crunching on the frost, and he lights his own fire. He adds a handful of resin, and the flame leaps up, bright and clear. He watches the flame burn for a moment, and then he descends again, back to his soup, back to his vigil. The message will reach the next station in an hour, and from there to the next, and so on, until it reaches the coast. The empire is awake, even in the depths of winter. And the Byzantines also had a practical way of dealing with the cold. They built hypocaust systems under the floors of their important buildings, channeling hot air from a furnace through clay pipes. In the winter, the bishop's palace and the public baths would be warm, and the people would gather there to escape the chill. The baths were not just for cleanliness, they were a social ritual, a way of keeping the body and the spirit warm. The warm water, the steam, the laughter, all of it was a rebellion against the cold. But perhaps the most intimate winter survival strategy in the Byzantine world was the practice of fasting and feasting according to the church calendar. The winter was a time of many fasts, especially the Nativity fast before Christmas and the Great Fast before Easter. The fasts were a way of stretching the food stores, of eating simply and sparingly, so that the community would not run out of supplies before the spring harvest. But the fasts were also a spiritual discipline, a way of reminding the people that they were not alone, that their suffering was shared with the saints and the angels. And when the fast ended, the feast was all the sweeter. I think, dear listener, of a Byzantine family in Constantinople, living in a small house near the Theodosian walls. The father is a merchant, and he has been unable to travel because the roads are blocked. He is restless, pacing the room. The mother is kneading dough for bread, her hands steady and rhythmic. The children are playing with a carved wooden horse. The grandmother is sitting by the stove, telling a story about the old days when the snow was so deep that the wolves walked on the rooftops. The story is not true, but it does not matter. It is a story, and it fills the room with warmth. The father stops pacing. He sits down next to the stove, and he listens. The bread is baking, and the smell fills the room. The grandmother's voice is low and soothing. The wind outside is a distant memory. This is the winter. This is how it has always been. And so, dear listener, we have traveled from the Mongol steppes to the Norwegian fjords, from the Roman roads to the Byzantine beacons. We have seen the winter as the empire saw it, not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a partner in the long dance of survival. The roads closed, yes, but the human spirit opened, finding new ways to stay connected, to stay warm, to stay alive. The stories, the songs, the rituals, the simple acts of tending the fire and feeding the animals, all of these were threads in a vast tapestry of resilience. Let us lie down now in our own warm beds and let these images drift through our minds. The Mongol rider on the frozen plain, the Viking wife spinning by the fire, the Byzantine watchman lighting his beacon, the Roman master of the villa sipping his wine. They are all here with us in this moment. Their winters were long, but they were not empty. They were filled with the quiet work of staying alive, and that work was, in its own way, a kind of art. And we, tonight, are the inheritors of that art. We carry it in our bones, in the way we check the weather, in the way we stock the pantry, in the way we gather our loved ones close when the wind blows. The snow is falling now, somewhere in the world. The roads are closing, one by one. But the fires are burning, and the stories are being told. Sleep, dear listener, sleep, and let the ancient winter hold you. But before you drift off entirely, dear listener, let me tell you one more story. Not a long one, but a soft one. It happened in a land far to the east, where the mountains rise like frozen waves, and the rivers turn to stone for half the year. This is the winter of the Chinese Empire, under the Tang dynasty, when the roads from Chang'an to the Silk Road outposts were choked with snow. and the only way to keep the empire breathing was a network of relay stations and a quiet, ancient trust in the rhythm of the seasons. Imagine, if you will, a small courier station on the edge of the Gobi Desert. The year does not matter, for this winter has happened countless times. The station is a squat building of mud, brick, and timber, with a low roof and a single chimney that breathes a thin column of smoke into the gray sky. Inside, the keeper of the station, a man named Wei, is banking the fire for the night. He has been awake for 3 days because the last messenger arrived just before the blizzard, and now the messenger is asleep on a kang, a heated brick bed that is the heart of every northern home in winter. The kang is warm, fed by the same fire that heats the room, and the messenger's cloak is steaming gently as it dries over a wooden rack. Wei looks at the messenger and feels a quiet pride. This man has ridden 100 miles through snow that blurred the path, trusting only his horse and the faint memory of the road markers buried deep in drifts. He carried a bamboo scroll sealed with wax, a dispatch from the governor of a distant province to the emperor himself. The scroll is now safe in a leather pouch, waiting for the storm to lift so the message can be carried on. Wei does not know what the message says. It is not his place to know, but he knows that it matters. It is a thread connecting the vast empire to itself, and in winter, threads are everything. Outside, the wind is a constant low moan, like a stringed instrument left untuned. The snow has filled every crevice, and the path from the station to the stable is only a dark trench shoveled out hours ago. Wei's horse, a sturdy Mongol pony, stands in the stable with 3 others, their breath clouding the cold air. Wei has given them hay and a little bit of warm barley mash because they too must survive the night. He listens to the horses shift and snort, and the sound is as comforting as the crackle of the fire. Now, dear listener, Wei's winter is not the winter of a grand palace or a bustling city. It is the winter of a single man in a small room waiting. But this waiting is not empty. It is filled with small rituals that keep the mind and the body alive. Wei checks the fire, adds a piece of dried dung from the basket, stirs the pot of millet porridge that has been simmering all day. He dips a wooden ladle into the pot and tastes the porridge plain, but warm, and that is enough. He thinks of his wife, who is 3 days' ride away in a village that is also buried in snow. She will be sitting by her own fire, spinning hemp or mending a coat. She will be safe. That is all he needs to know. And then Wei sits down on the kang, next to the sleeping messenger, and he begins to tell a story. It is a story he has told many times, a tale from the old days, about a scholar who was lost in the mountains and befriended a fox spirit who led him to a warm cave. The fox spirit was kind, but she was also wise, and she taught the scholar the secret of making fire from 2 stones and the secret of finding food even when the snow is deep. The scholar, in gratitude, wrote a poem about her, and the poem was so beautiful that the fox spirit wept, and her tears turned into pearls, and those pearls are still hidden somewhere in the mountains. waiting for a worthy person to find them. The messenger stirs in his sleep and murmurs something. Wei continues the story, his voice low and steady. The fire pops. The wind howls. The night is long, but it is also soft. It is a winter night like any other, and it is enough. Now, let us travel even further east to the islands of Japan, where the winter closed the roads of the Fujiwara period, and the people turned inward to the warmth of the hearth and the precision of the season. In Kyoto, the imperial capital, the winters were cold, but rarely harsh. But in the northern provinces, the snow could fall for weeks, turning the mountain passes into white labyrinths. The samurai lords of the north kept their domains alive through a system of mutual obligation and careful storage. They built storehouses on stilts, raised above the snow, and they filled them with rice, dried fish, and pickled vegetables. They also kept bees, not just for honey, but for wax, which could be made into candles that burned through the long, dark evenings. And in those evenings, the people of the north would gather in the main hall of the clan, a large wooden building with a sunken hearth in the center. The smoke would rise through a hole in the roof, and the flames would cast dancing shadows on the walls painted with scenes of battle and cherry blossoms. They would sit on tatami mats close to the fire, and they would drink warm sake from small cups, passing the flask around the circle. They would talk of the harvest, of the taxes, of the spring planting, but mostly they would tell stories, the old tales of the gods, the epic of the Hike clan, the adventures of the warrior Minamoto no Yashitsune. The stories were familiar, but they did not grow stale. They were like the fire itself, the same flames, but always new, always warm. I think, dear listener, of a young woman named Hana, the daughter of a minor samurai in the snowy province of Dua. She is 16 winters old, and she has never left her valley. Her world is the clan compound, the frozen river, the forest of cedars, the line of smoke from her neighbor's roof. In the winter, she helps her mother prepare the pickled vegetables, rubbing salt into the daikon radish, packing the cabbage into earthenware jars. She also weaves straw sandals for the household, her fingers moving quickly, the straw soft and warm from the steam of the hearth. She is learning to read, by candlelight, from a scroll of poems written by a lady of the court. The poems are about love and loss and the fleeting beauty of the cherry blossom, but Hana reads them with a different feeling. She knows that winter is long and that the cherry blossom will come, but she also knows that the winter is a time of its own beauty, a beauty of stillness and silence, and the quiet work of staying alive. One night, a messenger arrives at the compound, exhausted and half frozen. He has come from the coast, 3 days through the snow, and he brings news that a shipment of salt and iron has been delayed. Hana's father receives the news with a calm nod. He orders the messenger to be given food and a warm place to sleep. Then he calls Hana to him. Hana, he says, the winter is hard, but we are not alone. The salt will come. The iron will come. We will make do with what we have. Hana listens, and she understands. She is part of a web a network of obligations that stretches across the mountains and the valleys. The roads are closed, but the connections remain. They are carried by messengers on foot, by the smoke of fires, by the memory of promises made last harvest. She returns to her weaving, and the straw slides through her fingers. The winter is long, but it is not empty. And so, dear listener, we have wandered through the winters of 3 empires: the Tang Relay Station, the Fujiwara Samurai Hall, and the humble Viking farmstead. But there is one more winter I want to share with you. A winter that belongs to a different kind of empire, an empire of the mind, of the heart. It is the winter of the scholars, the ones who stayed indoors and wrote down the stories of the old ways, preserving them for the spring that always came, even if it was a spring many generations away. In the monasteries of Ireland, in the early Middle Ages, the roads were often impassable, but the monks kept the light of learning alive in their scriptoria. They sat in the cold stone rooms, their breath visible, their fingers numb, and they copied manuscripts by candlelight. They wrote in Latin, but also in the old Irish tongue, preserving the poems of the bards, the laws of the land, the tales of the heroes. The winters were long, and the food was meager porridge and bread and a little beer, but the work was steady. The monks believed that they were keeping the world connected to its past, and that in the spring, the knowledge would spread again. I think of a monk named Colman, sitting in a small cell in a monastery on the west coast of Ireland. The wind off the Atlantic is fierce, and the rain has turned to sleet. He has a small fire, but the wood is damp and it smokes. His eyes are tired from the small script, but he is copying a passage from the Book of Kells, or something like it, the intricate spirals and knots of the illuminated letters, each one a prayer. He paints red and blue and gold, mixing his pigments from crushed berries and ox gall and powdered stones. The letters glow on the page, small suns against the dark of the winter. Outside, the sheep are huddled in the lee of a stone wall. The cows are in the byre, chewing their cud. The roads are rivers of mud, and the king's messengers are stuck in a village 10 miles away. But Colman does not worry about the roads. His road is the page, and he is traveling on it, letter by letter, word by word, into the heart of the story. He finishes a line, and he looks up. The sleet has turned to snow, and the cell is quiet. He hears the faint sound of the other monks singing the night office in the chapel, their voices low and melodic, like the wind in the reeds. He puts down his pen, and he listens. The song is old, older than the winter, older than the empire. It is the sound of people keeping themselves alive, not just in body, but in spirit. It is the sound of hope. And that, dear listener, is the secret that all these winters share. The roads closed, but the people opened. They opened their homes, their hearts, their hands to the cold and the dark, and they found, in the small acts of survival, a kind of grace. The Mongol rider, the Viking spinner, the Byzantine watchman, the Tang courier, the Japanese weaver, the Irish scribe, all knew that winter was not an interruption of life, but a part of it, a deep and necessary rest, a time when the world slowed down and the connections between people grew stronger. The snow is still falling somewhere tonight. The roads are still closing, but the fires are still burning and the stories are still being told. Let yourself drift now, dear listener, into the quiet. Let the images settle around you like snow on a field. The horse breathing in the stable, the hearth crackling in the long hall, the brush moving across the parchment, the voices, low and calm, telling the old tales. These are the sounds of winter, and they have been heard for 1,000 years. Sleep now, sleep, and let the ancient winter hold you a little longer. There is no need to hurry. The spring will come when it comes. Until then, there is only the fire, the story, and the warm weight of history around you, like a blanket woven from all the winters that have ever been. But before you drift off completely, dear listener, let me take you to a winter in a different kind of empire, one that did not know the wheel nor the horse, yet still kept its people alive when the snow closed the high passes of the Andes. The Inca Empire stretched along the spine of the mountains, a long ribbon of stone-paved roads that climbed from the cloud forest to the frozen peaks. And when winter came, those roads became treacherous, buried under drifts of white, the bridges of rope and wood swaying in the icy wind. The messengers, the chasquis, still ran, but more slowly, their bare feet wrapped in rags, their breath pluming like smoke. They carried quipus, the knotted cords of colored thread that held the empire's memory, the number of llamas, the bushels of corn, the names of the dead. In the high valley of the sacred river, near the town of Ollantaytambo, the villagers prepared for the long cold. They had no iron, no glass, no candles made from beeswax, but they had the earth itself. They built kalkas, storehouses of stone and mortar, set into the hillsides where the wind was constant and the air dry. In these chambers, shaped like beehives, they stored the harvest. Potatoes freeze-dried into chuño, black and light as pumice, maize in earthen jars, dried llama meat called charqui, sliced thin and salted. The kalkas were the empire's lungs, breathing out food when the fields lay silent under frost. I think of a woman named Tupac, though that was a common name, and she was common in the way of most people, invisible to history, but essential to survival. She is perhaps 40 winters old, her face lined by sun and wind, her hair braided with red wool. She lives in a compound of adobe and stone, with her husband and 3 children, and her mother, who is very old and cannot see well. They share the space with a few guinea pigs, which scurry underfoot, and a llama that stands patient in the corner, its wool thick against the cold. There is no hearth in the center, but a small fire in a clay brazier, fed with dried llama dung and a few sticks of quenua wood. The smoke rises through the thatch, and the room is warm, but the warmth is a small thing, a bubble of heat in a vast cold world. Tupac wakes before dawn. The stars are still bright, and the frost has sketched white patterns on the windowsill. She wraps a shawl of alpaca wool around her shoulders, and she goes to the kalka at the edge of the village. The door is a slab of stone, and she slides it aside, careful not to disturb the seal. Inside, The air is cold and still, and she can feel the weight of the food around her, the dark chuño, the golden maize, the leathery strips of meat. She counts by touch, her fingers moving over the dried shapes. She takes what the family will need for the next few days, and she closes the door again, sealing the rest for later. The sun rises over the mountains, and the village stirs. The children are sent to gather firewood, dry branches, dung, anything that will burn. The men check the irrigation channels, which are frozen but must be kept clear for when the thaw comes. The women grind maize on flat stones, the rhythmic scrape, 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 a kind of music that has played every morning for 1,000 years. Tupac sits with her mother, who is telling a story to the youngest child, a boy of 5. The story is of the first people who emerged from a cave and walked into the light, and how they learned to plant corn and to weave and to build houses of stone. The boy listens, his eyes wide, his fingers wrapped around a piece of charqui that he chews slowly. And in the evenings, when the wind picks up and the cold becomes a presence, a solid thing that presses against the walls, the family gathers around the brazier. They eat a stew of chuño and corn with a little meat, and they drink a thin beer made from fermented maize. They talk of the coming spring, of the planting, of the repairs to the roof. But mostly they are quiet, because there is no need for words. The fire is enough. The presence of each other is enough. And sometimes the village leader, the curaca, comes to the door with news from the empire. A runner has arrived from Cusco, he says, with a message from the Sapa Inca. The roads are bad, but the message is good. The temples have prayed for a good harvest, and the gods are pleased. There will be a festival when the snow melts, and new cloth and new food will be distributed to the people. Tupac listens, and she nods. She does not fully understand the politics of the empire, but she understands that the message is a thread, a connection to the great world beyond her valley. The roads are closed, but the empire still speaks through the runners and the quipus and the stories that travel from village to village like seeds on the wind. And so the winter passes, day by day, night by night. The snow comes and goes. The cold deepens and then softens. The kalkas empty slowly, but they do not run dry. The people grow thin, but they do not starve. And in the long evenings, the old stories are told again and again, the same tales of the gods and the heroes, the same lessons about how to live in a world that is often harsh, but also filled with beauty. The stories are like the fire. They do not change, but they change the people who hear them. Dear listener, I think of Tupac, sitting in the adobe room, her hands busy with a piece of weaving. She is making a belt, a narrow band of alpaca wool, dyed red and blue and green. The pattern is ancient, the same pattern her mother taught her, the same pattern her grandmother taught her mother. It is a pattern of mountains and rivers and the steps of the llama. She weaves slowly, her fingers moving in the firelight, and she hums a song that has no words. The wind howls outside, but inside, the room is a warm cocoon, a small world of wool and earth and quiet breath. The winter of the Inca was not a season of suffering, but a season of deepening. people did not fight the cold, they leaned into it. They stored for it. They told stories to outlast it. And when the spring came, and it always came, they emerged from their houses, blinking in the sun, their bodies thin but their spirits full. They had survived not because they were strong, but because they were connected. The empire was a web of obligations, 1,000 threads that stretched from the Kalka to the runner to the family in the adobe room. And in the winter, those threads grew stronger because they were all that held the world together. So now, dear listener, as you drift toward the quiet edge of sleep, let the image of the Inca winter settle in your mind. See the stone storehouses, like small hills, scattered across the high valleys. See the runners, their feet wrapped in rags, moving through the snow with knotted cords in their hands. See the families gathered around small fires, their faces lit by the flame, their hands busy with weaving or grinding or telling the old tales. There's no hurry in this world. There's only the slow, patient work of staying alive and the gentle, persistent thread of connection that binds one winter to the next. And the fire still burns. The story still goes on. The winter is not an end, but a pause, a breath held for a long time and then released. Let yourself breathe with it. Let the cold be something you can feel, but not something that frightens you. You are part of the ancient web too. You are listening and remembering, and that is enough. The roads will open again. The snow will melt. But for now, there is only this moment, this warmth, this voice in the dark. And the thread continues, winding through the centuries, from the Kalka to the scriptorium, to the long hall of the samurai. There is always a winter, and there is always a way. And the way is the story itself. So rest, dear listener. Rest, and let the old empires hold you just a little longer. The night is deep, and the world is wide. But the small fire of your attention is enough to light the path through the snow. But wait, dear listener, the thread has not yet finished its journey. The night is deep, and the world is wide, but the small fire of your attention is enough to light the path through the snow. And that path leads onward, across oceans and centuries, to another island, another winter, another empire that learned to keep its people alive when the roads closed. Let us travel now, in the quiet of this hour, to the islands of Japan, where the mountains rise steep from the sea, and the winter winds carry a salt sharpness and the scent of pine. Imagine, if you will, a village nestled in a narrow valley, with a river that runs swift and cold from the high peaks. The houses are built of wood and paper, with roofs of thatch or tile, and they huddle close together, their eaves almost touching, as if for warmth. The winter here is not the dry cold of the Andes, but a wet cold, a cold that seeps through the bones, that turns the rain into sleet, and the sleet into snow that piles against the doors until they cannot be opened. The rice fields lie fallow under a white blanket, and the paths that lead to the next village are hidden, lost, erased by the storm. This is the Japan of the Heian period, or perhaps a little later, the Kamakura, when the samurai lords ruled and the emperor was a shadow behind screens of silk. But in the village, the lords are a distant rumor, a name spoken in tax records and temple prayers. The people are farmers, fishermen, foresters. They know the land by heart, and they know the winter by its weight, its length, its hunger. The Empire of Japan, like the Inca, had a system of storage and distribution. The rice granaries were built on stilts, raised above the damp earth to keep the grain dry and safe from rats. They were called kura, and they stood at the edge of every village, their wooden walls weathered gray, their roofs steep to shed the snow. In autumn, when the rice was harvested, a portion was set aside for the Lord's tax, a portion for the temple, and a portion for the village itself. The rest was stored in the kura, layer upon layer of polished white rice, the lifeblood of the island. But rice alone is not enough. The Japanese winter demanded a richer store, a more varied pantry. The people salted fish and dried it in the wind, hanging it from the eaves until it became stiff and translucent, like sheets of amber. They pickled vegetables, daikon radish, eggplant, cucumber in brine and rice bran, packing them into earthenware jars that burbled quietly in the corners of the kitchen. They made miso, that thick paste of fermented soybeans, which could be scooped into hot water to make a soup that warmed the belly and the soul. They boiled seaweed and pressed it into sheets, and they stored chestnuts and persimmons dried in the sun, their sweetness concentrated, their flesh chewy and dark. And in the deep of winter, when the snow lay heavy and the roads were only a memory, the people relied on these stores. They would sit around the irari, the sunken hearth in the center of the room, where a fire of pine and oak crackled and popped. The smoke rose through a hole in the roof, but some of it lingered, a blue haze that smelled of wood and incense and the past. The kettle hung from an iron hook, and inside it water simmered, waiting for tea or for miso. I think of a woman named Kiyo, though that was a common name, and she was common in the way of most people. She lives with her husband, a fisherman named Taro, and their 2 children, a boy of 10 and a girl of 7. Her mother lives with them too, a small woman with silver hair and eyes that have seen 60 winters. Their house has a single room with floor of packed earth covered in straw mats, and a narrow alcove where a scroll of calligraphy hangs, a poem about cherry blossoms, written by a monk who passed through the village long ago. Kiyo wakes before dawn as the snow continues to fall, silent and patient. She stokes the embers of the fire, adding a few pieces of charcoal, and she sets the kettle to boil. She goes to the storeroom, a small shed attached to the back of the house, where the jars of pickles are stacked, where the dried fish hang from the rafters, where the rice is kept in a wooden box with a tight lid. She counts by feel, her fingers moving over the smooth ceramic of the jars, the rough texture of the dried seaweed, the weight of the rice box. She takes what the family will need for the day: a handful of rice, a piece of dried fish, a few pickled radishes. She closes the door behind her, and the cold does not follow her inside. The children wake, rubbing their eyes, their breath visible in the chill air. They sit close to the fire, and Kiyo prepares the morning meal, rice porridge, with a little miso stirred in and a piece of dried fish flaked on top. They eat in silence, the only sound the gentle sucking of wooden chopsticks and the crackle of the fire. The boy, Kenji, asks if he can go outside to play in the snow, but Kiyo shakes her head. The snow is too deep, she says. Later, perhaps, when the wind dies. But later does not come. The storm continues for 3 days, and the village is buried in white. The men cannot go to the forest for firewood. The women cannot walk to the well. They ration the water from the barrel that catches rainwater from the roof. They check the stores every morning, and every evening they count the days until the snow will melt. They do not panic, because panic is a luxury that winter does not allow. Instead, they tell stories. The old mother, Hana, sits by the fire and tells the children the tale of Momotaro, the peach boy, who was born from a giant peach and went to fight the Oni, the demons of the island. She tells it slowly, her voice thin but steady, and the children listen, their eyes fixed on the flames. They have heard the story 100 times, but it never grows old. The details change slightly each time. This time, the peach is larger, the demons more fearsome, the dog, the monkey, and the pheasant more loyal. The children ask questions, and Hana answers, her hands busy with a piece of cloth she is mending. And in the evenings, when the fire is low and the wind howls like a hungry beast, the village gathers in the largest house, the house of the village headman. They sit on the floor, their backs against the pillars, their bodies wrapped in padded jackets of cotton and indigo. The headman, a man named Goro, lights a lantern and reads from a scroll of Buddhist sutras. The words are ancient, the language half understood, but the rhythm is soothing, a counterpoint to the storm. Then someone brings out a pot of tea, and they talk of the spring, of the planting, of the repairs to the roof. They share news from the outside world, news that came before the snow closed the pass, a message from the Lord, a letter from a son in the capital, a rumor of bandits in the next province. And Kiyo sits with her family, and she feels the warmth of the fire, and she feels the closeness of the bodies around her, and she thinks of the rice in the granary, and the fish in the rafters, and the pickles in the jars. She knows that the empire is far away, but the empire is also here, in this room, in this village, in the tax that was paid and the granary that was filled. The empire is a promise, and the promise is that the winter will not last forever. The snow will melt, the roads will open, the boats will come, but the empire is also a burden. The Lord demands his rice, his labor, his loyalty. The samurai ride through the village twice a year, their armor clinking, their horses snorting in the cold. They take a portion of the harvest, and they leave a receipt written in brush and ink. The villagers do not complain, because complaint is useless. They know that the empire is a machine that grinds slow but steady, and the wheels of the machine are made of rice and mud and human bones. And yet, despite the weight of obligation, the empire also provides. In times of famine, the Lord might open the granaries and distribute rice to the hungry. The temples, too, held stores of grain and medicine, and the monks would walk through the villages in the deepest winter, their robes thin, their bowls empty, offering prayers and receiving food in return. The bond between the village and the temple was a thread that held the winter together, a thread of rice and incense and shared supplication. Dear listener, I think of Kyo sitting in the firelight, her fingers stained with ink from a letter she is writing to her brother, who lives in a village on the coast. The letter will not be sent until the spring, when the roads are open, but she writes it anyway, because writing is a way of speaking across the distance, a way of keeping the thread alive. She writes of the snow, of the children, of the miso that is almost gone. She writes of the dream she had last night, a dream of cherry blossoms, pink and white, falling on a river of green water. She seals the letter with a drop of wax, and she places it on the shelf, next to the scroll of the Bodhisattva canon, who looks down with eyes of infinite compassion. The winter of Japan was not a season of death, but a season of waiting. The people did not rage against the cold they abided. They stored, they preserved, they told stories, they wrote letters that would not be sent, they mended clothes that would be worn again in the spring. They lived in a world that was small, but also infinite, because the mind can travel where the body cannot. And the empire, for all its flaws, was a net that caught them when they fell, a net woven of rice and paper and the slow, patient work of generations. So let us rest now, dear listener, in the warmth of the Irari, with the kettle humming and the snow piling against the door. Let the story of Kyo and her family settle into your mind like a soft blanket. See the jars of pickles, the dried fish, the box of rice. See the children's faces flushed with heat, their eyes heavy with sleep. See the old mother, her hands still, her voice a murmur. The fire crackles, the snow falls, and the empire holds its breath, waiting for the thaw. But the thread does not end here, not yet. There's another winter, another empire, another way. The roads are closed, but the story continues, winding through the centuries, from the Kura of Japan to the long hall of the samurai, and beyond to the frozen rivers of Russia, the steppes of Mongolia, the walled cities of the Silk Road. Each winter is a lesson, each empire a teacher, and the lesson is always the same. Store what you can, share what you have, and tell the stories that keep the darkness at bay. Rest, dear listener, rest, and let the old empires hold you just a little longer. The night is deep, the world is wide, but the small fire of your attention is enough to light the path through the snow. The kettle is warm, the miso is ready, and the story, like the rice in the granary, will last until the spring. But the story does not end with the snow, nor with the spring. For the empire is vast, and the winter touches many lands. Let us drift now, dear listener, across the sea, to the western edge of another empire, where the roads are also closed, and the cold is a different kind of enemy. Let us go to the frozen rivers of Britannia, where the legions of Rome once huddled in their forts, and the wind carried the salt of the ocean mixed with the smoke of peat fires. Picture a small fort, built of stone and turf, on a hill overlooking a gray river. The year is perhaps the 3rd century after the birth of Christ, though no one in the fort counts the years that way. They count by the reigns of emperors, by the years of service, by the number of winters they have survived. The fort is called Arborlow, though the local Britons call it something else, a name that means the place of the standing stones, for the old monuments are scattered across the nearby moor, their purpose forgotten, their presence a reminder that the land has known many masters. The commanding officer is a man named Marcus. He is a centurion, middle-aged, his back bent from years of carrying armor and authority. He sits in his quarters, a small room with a brazier of charcoal, a writing desk, and a stack of letters that will not be sent until the spring. The letters are from his wife, who lives in a town in Gaul, and from his son, who is training to be a soldier in the city of Eboracum. Marcus reads them by the light of a tallow candle, his lips moving silently, and he writes his replies on a wax tablet, knowing that the wax will be smoothed over and reused when he runs out of space. He writes of the weather, of the supplies, of the dream he had last night, a dream of the sun warming the stones of the forum. He does not write of the hunger, because the hunger is a constant companion, and he does not want to worry his wife. He does not write of the cold that seeps into his bones, the cold that makes his joints ache every morning. He does not write of the men who have died in the night, their bodies found stiff and gray in the barracks, victims of the winter sickness that the doctors call pneumonia and the soldiers call the cough. Outside, the fort is quiet. The watchmen walk the ramparts, their breath-forming clouds that drift away into the darkness. The snow has fallen for 3 days, and the drifts are high against the walls. The river is frozen solid, and the road that leads south to the legionary fortress at Deva is impassable. There will be no supply wagons, no messengers, no relief until the thaw. The fort is alone, a small island of Roman order in a sea of snow and barbarian tribes who are also waiting, also hungry, also dreaming of the spring. But the empire has planned for this. The granaries are full of wheat and barley, dried peas and lentils. The cellars hold amphorae of wine and olive oil, jars of garum, the fermented fish sauce that the Romans put on everything. There are barrels of salted pork and beef, and racks of smoked sausages hanging from the rafters. The armorer has a supply of iron and leather for repairs. The doctor has a chest of dried herbs and bandages. The scribe has a stack of blank papyrus and a pot of ink that has not yet frozen. And yet, despite the stores, the winter is a time of scarcity. The men receive half rations, and the officers receive not much more. The wine is watered down, the bread is coarse and heavy. The meat is tough and salty. The men complain, but they do not mutiny, because mutiny is a luxury that winter does not allow. They know that the empire is watching, even from a distance, and that the empire will remember. They know that the supplies are carefully counted, and that any theft or waste will be punished when the roads open. They know that the empire is a machine, and that the machine does not forgive. But the empire also provides in its own way. The state operates a postal service, the cursus publicus, which brings letters and official dispatches even in the winter, when the roads are treacherous. The messengers ride on horseback, changing horses at stations every 20 miles, and they carry the letters in leather pouches strapped to their chests. They are brave men, or foolish men, or men who have no choice. They ride through the snow, through the rain, through the wind, and they do not stop until they reach their destination. They are the arteries of the empire, carrying the lifeblood of information. One such messenger arrives at Arbor Low on a night when the moon is full, and the snow is blue and silver in its light. He is a young man, his face chapped and raw, his hands wrapped in strips of wool. He carries a dispatch from the provincial governor, a letter sealed with wax and stamped with the imperial eagle. Marcus breaks the seal and reads by the brazier. The letter is brief. The grain shipment expected in the autumn was delayed, but a replacement convoy will leave Deva as soon as the snow melts. In the meantime, the garrison is to conserve supplies and maintain order. The letter ends with a formulaic phrase: "The Emperor and the Senate wish you a safe and prosperous winter." Marcus sets the letter aside and looks at the messenger. The young man is shivering, his teeth chattering. Marcus orders his servant to bring hot broth and a blanket. The messenger drinks the broth slowly, his hands cupped around the bowl, and he tells Marcus of the road, of the villages he passed, of the bodies he saw lying in the snow. He tells of a farmhouse where the family had died of starvation, their faces peaceful, their hands folded, as if they had fallen asleep and simply not woken up. He tells of a river that had frozen so hard that the ice had cracked and the water had risen, flooding the fields and killing the livestock. He tells of the wolves, how they followed him for a mile, their eyes glowing in the dark, until he reached the fort and the sentries drove them away. Marcus listens, his face still, his hands resting on his knees. He has heard such stories before, every winter, from every messenger. The empire is vast, and the winter is indiscriminate. The snow does not care about rank or citizenship. It falls on the rich and the poor, the soldier and the civilian, the Roman and the barbarian. And yet, the empire endures. The fort endures. Marcus and his men endure. They endure because they have learned the oldest lesson: store what you can, share what you have, and tell the stories that keep the darkness at bay. And they do tell stories. In the evenings, when the fire is low and the wind howls like 1,000 hungry mouths, the men gather in the mess hall. They sit on benches, their cloaks wrapped around them, their cups of watered wine in their hands. They tell stories of Rome, of the great city, of the baths and the temples and the markets. They tell stories of battles they have fought, of victories and defeats, of comrades who died and are remembered only in these stories. They tell jokes, crude jokes, jokes that make them laugh and forget the cold. And sometimes, when the mood is right, a man will play a pipe or a lyre, and the others will sing a song from their homeland, a song that speaks of the sun and the sea and the girl they left behind. One of the men, a Briton named Caradoc, tells a story of his people, the tribe of the Brigantes. He tells of the winter when the world was young, when the goddess of the snow fought the goddess of the sun, and the sun won, but only by a little, and that is why the winter is short and the summer is long. He tells it in a low voice, his accent thick, and the other men listen, even the Romans, because the story is old and the story is true in its own way. The story is a way of making sense of the cold, a way of giving the winter a face and a name, so that it becomes something you can argue with, something you can defeat. And Marcus sits at the head of the table, his back straight, his eyes half closed. He thinks of his wife, her hands smoothing the linen sheets, her voice humming a lullaby. He thinks of his son, learning to hold a sword, learning to stand in formation, learning to be a Roman. He thinks of the empire, of the roads that connect the world, of the laws that bind the provinces, of the grain that feeds the cities. He thinks of the winter, and he knows that the winter is also a test of the empire, a test of the men who serve it. And he knows that the empire will pass the test because it has passed every winter before, and it will pass every winter after. But the winter does not only test the soldiers, it tests the civilians, the farmers, the merchants, the slaves. In the town that lies a day's march from the fort, the people are also waiting. The market is empty, the shops are shuttered. The baker bakes only a few loaves each morning, using the last of the flour. The butcher has killed his last pig and hung it in the cold storage. The doctor tends to the sick, the old, the children who cough and shiver in their beds. The town is small, but it is part of the empire, and the empire has not forgotten it. A woman named Livia lives in a narrow house on the main street. She is the widow of a soldier, and she rents a room to a scribe who works in the fort. She has 2 children, a boy and a girl. She keeps a small garden behind the house, but the winter has killed the vegetables, and the soil is frozen solid. She survives by selling eggs from her chickens, and by the rent the scribe pays. She also receives a small pension from the empire, a few coins each month, for her husband's service. It is not enough, but it is something. It is a thread connecting her to the state, a thread of bronze and silver and the loyalty of the dead. In the evenings, Livia sits by the fire and tells her children stories. She tells them about Rome, about the great city, about the statues and the fountains and the emperors. She tells them about their father, how he was a brave soldier, how he died in the defense of the frontier, how he is remembered in the records of the legion. She tells them that the empire will take care of them, that the roads will open, that the spring will come. The children listen, their eyes wide, their faces lit by the flames. They ask questions, and Livia answers, her voice soft and steady. She tells them about the granaries, the supply depots, the postal service, all the invisible machinery of the empire that keeps them alive. She tells them that the winter is a time of waiting, but that waiting is not useless. Waiting is a form of work, a form of faith. And when the children are asleep, Livia takes out a small box of cedar wood. Inside is a letter from her husband, the last letter he wrote before he died. The ink is faded, the papyrus is cracked. She reads it slowly, her finger tracing the words. He writes of the snow, of the cold, of the fort, of the men. He writes of a dream he had, a dream of her, standing in a field of wheat, the sun behind her, her hair golden. He writes that he loves her, that he will come home soon, that the empire will bring him back. She closes the box and places it on the shelf. next to a small statue of the goddess Fortuna, who holds a cornucopia and a wheel. The empire, dear listener, is a network of such small gestures, such quiet promises. The grain in the granary, the letter in the box, the pension in the coin purse. The empire is the road that connects the fort to the town to the city to the capital. The road is closed in winter, but it is not forgotten. The road is a memory, a hope, a plan, and the people who live along that road, who depend on that road, they wait. They wait with patience, with resignation, with the quiet faith that the road will open again. And so we leave the fort of Arbor Low, and the town, and the river, and the snow. We leave Marcus sitting by the brazier, his hand resting on the dispatch from the governor. We leave Livia standing at the window, watching the moon rise over the roofs. We leave the children sleeping, their breath soft and even. The winter continues, but the empire continues too. The empire is patient because the empire has survived 1,000 winters. The empire is slow because the empire moves on the rhythm of the seasons. The empire is a story, and the story is not finished. Now let us drift further east, across the frozen plains of Germania, across the Alps, across the lands of the Huns and the Goths. Let us come to a place where the snow is not a hindrance, but a way of life, where the roads are not paved with stone, but with the carcasses of horses and the bones of cattle. Let us come to the steppes of Central Asia, where the Mongol tribes winter in their felt tents, their herds of yaks and sheep huddled against the wind. The empire of the Mongols is a different kind of empire, a mobile empire, an empire of the horse. The winter does not close the roads because the roads are not fixed. The roads are wherever the horses can travel, and the horses can travel anywhere if the snow is not too deep. The winter on the steppe is harsh, but the Mongols have learned to live with it. Their tents, the jurs, are made of felt and wood, warm and windproof. They burn dried dung for fuel, and they drink fermented mare's milk, called arag, which is both nourishing and warming. They wear layers of fur and leather, and they sleep under heavy blankets of wool and felt. They move with the herds, following the grass, the water, the shelter of the valleys. They do not store food in granaries because they are not farmers. They store food on the hoof, in the bodies of their animals. A horse, a sheep, a yak is a walking storehouse of meat, milk, and blood. When the winter is hard, they slaughter the weakest animals and eat them. When the winter is very hard, they slaughter the strongest animals and eat them too, because survival comes before strength. A Mongol woman named Altensetseg, which means golden flower, sits in her jur, her hands busy with a strip of leather. She is making a pair of boots for her son, who is 9 years old and already learning to ride. The fire crackles in the center of the tent, the smoke rising to a hole in the roof. The floor is covered with carpets, and the walls are hung with tapestries. The family's possessions are few: a cooking pot, a set of knives, a saddle, a bow, a quiver of arrows. They are all that is needed for a life on the move. Outside, the snow is falling again, and the wind is picking up. The herds are nearby, guarded by the men and the dogs. Alton Setsig listens to the sound of the wind, the lowing of the cattle, the whinny of a horse. She knows that the winter will last another 2 months, perhaps 3. The grass is buried, the rivers are frozen, the world is white and empty. But she is not afraid. She has seen many winters. She has survived them all. The empire of the Mongols does not send letters, does not count grain, does not build forts. It sends riders, it counts horses, it builds alliances. The winter is a time of gathering, not of waiting. The tribes come together, trade stories, trade goods, trade brides. They sing songs of the ancestors, of the great Khans, of the battles won and the battles lost. They tell stories of the frost giants that live in the mountains, of the spirits that haunt the frozen rivers, of the wolves that are not wolves, but men transformed by sorcery. The stories are dark, but they are also comforting. They give the winter a shape, a meaning. And Alton Setseg continues her work, her fingers moving in the firelight. She thinks of her husband, who is out hunting with the men. She thinks of her son, who is learning to shoot a bow. She thinks of the spring, when the snow will melt and the grass will grow and the herds will fatten. She thinks of the empire, of the great Khan who rules from a distant city, who commands the allegiance of 100 tribes. She does not know his face, does not know his name, but she knows that he exists, that he is the center of the world, that the world is held together by his will. The empire is a story, and the story is told in the smoke of the fire, in the taste of the arag, in the warmth of the felt. And so, dear listener, the winter continues, from Rome to Japan, from Mongolia to Britannia. The snow falls, the fires burn, the stories are told. The empires hold their breath, waiting for the thaw, waiting for the roads to open, waiting for the boats to come. And we too, sitting here in the quiet of the night, we too are waiting. We are waiting for the spring, for the warmth, for the promise that the winter will not last forever. But we are not waiting in silence. We are waiting with stories, with the soft murmur of voices, with the crackle of the fire, with the gentle rhythm of the words. So rest, dear listener. Let the empires of the past wrap around you like a heavy blanket. Let the grain in the granary, the letters in the box, the boots in the tent, all the small and patient things, be your comfort. The night is long, but the story is longer. And the story, like the rice in the granary, like the wine in the amphora, like the dried fish in the rafters, will last until the spring. The spring will come. The roads will open. The boats will arrive. Until then, there is only the fire and the kettle and the voice that speaks to you across the centuries. Sleep now, sleep.